The Queen of Attolia, Chapter 6. As the winter passed, he forced himself to get up in the morning, even if it was only to sit in the chair at the foot of his bed to watch the fire in the fireplace. Some days he practiced his handwriting. In the night, when the palace was quiet, he woke and lay in bed for hours, staring at the shadows the fire cast on his ceiling. It was a thief's time, the middle of the night. Old habits died hard, and he couldn't sleep. He counted himself lucky if he didn't wake up screaming, and was glad that when he did have nightmares, there was no other apartment near the library where people might hear him. In the late winter, he was still working on his handwriting and studying the books and scrolls from the library. He was reading a text on a system for categorizing plants and animals when someone knocked on his door. He looked up to find a man standing in his doorway. Beside him, as if he just put it down, was a square leather box with a handle on top. "Can I help you?" Eugenides asked, puzzled. They sent me up to show you some things," the man said awkwardly. Eugenides had no trouble fitting a number of people into the category they. "What things?" he asked. The man pushed his box a little closer to where Eugenides sat. He unlatched and lifted the top to display the contents. Held in place by leather straps was an assortment of prosthetics, false hands and hooks. The hands were carved from wood, some of them fists, some partly open. The hooks were set in shiny brass or silver cups, inlaid or plain. "Get out," said Eugenides. "Young sir," the man protested. "Get out when you've looked." The man stood his ground. Eugenides got up from his chair and, after the briefest of looks into the box, fled. He strode across the library and slammed its door behind him. Eugenides went down the hallway past several startled servants and was running up stairs two at a time before he realized that he didn't want to go to the roof. On a fine day in late winter, it would be peopled with ladies walking the lookouts, tired of being shut in by the cold. He racked his brains to think of a refuge, but the library was his refuge, and he had been driven out. After a moment he turned and went back down the stairs and along the hall to another flight of steps, hurrying past people without speaking, thankful that he was dressed in clothes and not in his robe, as he often was in the morning, until he remembered that he was dressed only because his father's valet had stopped in that morning to prod him, no doubt in anticipation of his visitor. The thought made him savage, and the valet was lucky to be far away. He left the palace by way of a tiny courtyard that had a door in its stone wall that let him out onto a grass-covered slope. There was a paved path of white stones that led uphill from the gate to intersect the wider pavement of the Sacred Way. The Sacred Way swept back and forth across the hillside, working up to the great temple of Hesperia, which overlooked the palace. There were still patches of snow in the shade, and the wind blew through his thin shirt. The hill was steep, and he was quickly out of breath, but he climbed on until he reached the empty porch of the temple. He looked down at the palace, but there was no one climbing the Sacred Way behind him. He went through the main doors, 20 feet high and open to the cold air, into the pronos of the temple. The smaller set of doors that led into the nos were also open. As he passed from the pronos into the nos, his footsteps were quiet from habit. The altar was deserted. The incense burned in the braziers unattended by a priest, and there was no sign of supplicants or of a recent sacrifice. The great gilded statue of Hesperia looked down on no one, but Eugenides. He walked to the alcove just before the great altar, where there was a smaller altar dedicated to Eugenides, god of thieves. A curtain provided privacy to supplicants. Eugenides pulled it close and sat on one of the marble benches that ran along either side of the alcove. He lifted his feet up onto the bench out of sight of any casual glance under the curtain and wrapped his arms around his knees. He left his room without his sling. He wondered if anyone had had time to stare when he was hurrying past. He tilted his head back against the marble walls behind him and closed his eyes. He didn't look at the altar, decorated with an assortment of objects stolen by his ancestors and himself. He hadn't come to pray. He'd come to hide. The stars were out when Eugenides picked his way carefully down the road from the temple. He shivered as he slipped through the doorway into the courtyard and nodded to a guard as he entered the palace. The hallways were empty, and he passed no one else on the way back to his rooms. The library doors were open, and the light from the fireplace inside flickered in the dark hall. He paused at the doorway to look in and saw his father and the Queen sitting in silence in his armchairs, waiting for him. "You shouldn't be here," he said. They both stood. Eugenides looked at his father. "I was in the temple," he said. "We knew that," the Queen replied. "You could hardly be dragged home from there without risking a rain of thunderbolts, and now that you've been safe from being disturbed all day, you're blue with cold. Sit at the fire." Eugenides didn't sit by the fire. He lay down on the hearth in front of it, close enough to be burned by stray sparks, and pillowed his head on his arms, shuddering from the cold. "Cowardice has its own rewards," his father observed, looking down at him. "More than you can guess." Eugenides spoke into his arms. "Mora came. She brought me a message from the gods." The Queen and his father were silent. Eugenides rolled on his back to warm his other side. He stared at the ceiling. He knew that after the destruction of Hymettus's gift the year before, what had seemed an indelible belief in the goddess-given authority of the gift had slowly faded from most people's minds until the gods were once again a vague possibility instead of a nerve-wracking reality, even for his father. He counted on Eddis, who had held the gift, to believe still in the immortals. She looked suitably wary, whereas his father looked only politely interested. "Stop whining," Eugenides said. "What?" Eddis's expression shifted from wary to puzzled. "That was the message. For me, alone among the mortals, the gods send their messenger to tell me to stop whining. That'll teach me to go hide in a temple." "Eugenides," said Eddis. "And I thought I was doing fairly well," he said bitterly. "You've been locked in your room all winter practicing your handwriting," Eddis said. "Yes," said Eugenides. "And what do you plan to do when your handwriting was perfect?" his father asked. Eugenides sat up and shifted to lean against the heated stones beside the fireplace, with his legs stretched out in front of the fire to warm. "I thought I might go to one of the universities on the peninsula," he said at last. "I thought that if I went away to study, I could come back in a few years and be useful." He pulled his knees up. "I'm sorry," he shrugged. "I thought it was a good plan." Eddis looked at him helplessly, and then at his father. The Minister of War bent forward to put a hand under his son's armpit and lift him to his feet. "Bedtime, I think," he said. "We can discuss messages from gods when we've had some sleep. Things, he said, looking at the Queen, are sometimes not as they appear. The Queen left, and the minister helped his son to bed with a minimum of words. He pulled the overshirt and undershirt over Eugenie's head with a sharp tug, then directed him to the bed. "Sit," he said. Eugenie sat, and his father pulled off the rest of his clothes and dropped a nightshirt over his head. Then he pushed his son down onto the bed and pulled the covers over him. "You can wash in the morning," he said. Eugenides lay with his head on the pillows, looking up at the ceiling. "Do you need to eat?" his father asked. "I ate the ceremonial bread at the temple." His father shook his head in wonder. "No lightning bolts?" he asked. "Not one," said Eugenides. "How fortunate." He went to the door and stopped. "That business of going to the peninsula to study? What about it?" "It was a reasonable idea." Was? Eugenides wondered as he fell asleep.